She had $30, a worn-out bag, and an 8-month belly. Her family had shut the door in her face. The father of her child had disappeared the week she needed him most, and the road ahead of her, a red dirt road in the Tennessee hills, had no clear end. But she kept walking, because that's what you do when you have nothing left except the life growing inside you and the stubborn, terrifying belief that somewhere, there has to be one door that opens. And there was. It belonged to a man named Theodore Drummond, a man who hadn't smiled in 3 years, who ate alone every night at a table built for more than one, who had 800 acres of good land and not a single reason to come inside before dark. He almost didn't open the gate. He almost said no. And if he had, you wouldn't be here listening to this story. Because what happened next, in that farmhouse, on that land, over those long and beautiful and devastating months, it's the kind of thing that makes you believe again, in people, in second chances, in the quiet miracles that don't come with fanfare, that just show up one afternoon on a dirt road with a canvas bag and change everything. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Let's start at the gate. Before we do, if you're new here, subscribe. Right now. Because this channel is built for people who still believe that real love exists, that faith holds, and that the hardest seasons of life are sometimes growing the deepest roots. And tell me in the comments, what city are you watching from? I read every single one there was in the hill country of Tennessee, in the heart of a valley cradled by old green mountains and the red dust of unpaved roads, a farm called Good Hope. The name was old, inherited from times when the land promised abundance and the sky didn't take long to send rain. The farm had over 800 acres, a white farmhouse with tall windows, a wraparound porch of dark-stained wood, and a tobacco field that climbed up the hillside like a rippling carpet of broad, dark leaves. There was a cattle barn, a grain silo, a well, and the constant smell of wet earth on winter mornings. It had everything a prosperous farm needs, everything except life. Since Eleanor had died 3 years before, taken by a cancer that consumed her body with the cruel haste of diseases that give no warning, Good Hope had lost its soul. Not that the machinery stopped, not that the cattle stopped grazing or the tobacco stopped growing. Life continued in the fields with the indifference that only nature knows. But inside the farmhouse, silence had settled in like a guest no one invited and no one knew how to send away. Theodore Alves Drummond, Theo to anyone who knew him well enough to use a short name, which was fewer people than it should have been, was 42 years old, dark hair with the first silver threads at the temples, hands calloused from a man who works alongside his hands even when he doesn't have to, and the eyes of someone carrying a weight others can't see. He was a man of few words, of church every Sunday, of respecting his elders and honoring a handshake like a signed contract. He had inherited his mother's sensitivity and his father's stubbornness, a combination that made him a good man and a difficult one at the same time. After Eleanor left, Theo had folded into himself like a door someone closes slowly and locks from the inside. He let the housekeeper go. She couldn't stand the heavy silence of the house. He let the cleaning woman go. She cried every time she passed the room where Eleanor had spent her last months. Only old Earl remained, the farm manager of 56 years, who knew every inch of that land and who understood when to speak and when to stay quiet, a rare and valuable gift. And there was Miss Ruth Ann, a woman in her late 60s, nearly deaf, who made the best biscuits and gravy anyone in the county had tasted and who asked nobody anything about anything. Theo woke early, worked until dark, ate supper alone, and slept a sleep that never rested him. On weekends sometimes his father called from Nashville to demand results, to question decisions, to remind him that the farm needed a firm hand. Colonel James Drummond, everyone called him Colonel, though the title was more tradition than rank, was a man of another era, accustomed to authority, to a loud voice, and to being right about everything. He had never fully approved of how Theo managed Good Hope. He thought his son too sensitive, too careful with the farmhands, too generous with the tenant families. "A farm isn't a place for kindness, it's a place for profit," the colonel would say. A line Theo had heard so many times, he knew it by heart, and with which he had never once agreed. And it was in this farmhouse of silence and loneliness, on this land of fertile soil and hollow heart, that on an afternoon in March, with the sky heavy with clouds that promised rain but kept none of their promises, Catherine appeared. She arrived on foot along the dirt road, carrying a worn canvas duffel bag in one hand and the weight of an 8-month pregnancy in the other. 28 years old, brown hair pinned in a loose bun that the wind kept trying to undo, a face with fine features that exhaustion had marked, with deep shadows under her eyes. She wore a faded floral skirt and a white blouse that the heat had yellowed at the seams. She walked slowly, with that cautious step of someone who knows she cannot fall but is no longer certain of where she's stepping. Earl saw her first, standing at the entrance gate, checking on a fence that needed mending. He watched the woman approach with that enormous belly, alone, no car, no companion, nothing to explain what she was doing there. "Miss, can I ask what you need?" he said, removing his worn cap. Catherine stopped. She breathed deeply. She had rehearsed what she was going to say, had repeated the words the entire way there, but when she needed them, they disappeared. What remained was only the bare truth, without decoration. "I need a place to stay, just for a while. I'll work. I'll do anything. I can cook, clean, do laundry. I don't need much. Just a roof and food until the baby is born and I can get myself sorted out." Earl looked at the belly, then at her face, then at the road behind her, as if expecting to see someone following. There was no one. "You got family around here?" "No," she said. And in that one word lived an entire world of pain she was not prepared to explain there, at the gate, to a man she didn't know. The old foreman was quiet for a moment. His wife always said he had a nose for people, that he could look into someone's eyes and know whether they were trustworthy or not. And in Catherine's eyes, there was exhaustion, there was fear, there was a fractured dignity still standing through sheer stubbornness. There was no malice, of that he was certain. "Wait here," he said. "I'll get the boss." Theo was in the office, reviewing production spreadsheets with a furrowed brow, when Earl knocked on the door and entered with that specific expression the old man used when he needed to say something he knew the boss wouldn't want to hear. "What is it, Earl?" "There's a young woman at the gate, boss, pregnant, about to deliver. She's alone, and she's asking for a place to stay in exchange for work." Theo looked at the foreman over his reading glasses. "Earl, I can't really." "I know, boss. Just thought you ought to see it with your own eyes before sending her away." There was something in the old man's voice that made Theo get up. He left the office, crossed the porch, walked down the steps, and went to the gate. When he saw Catherine, he stopped. She didn't beg. She didn't cry. She stood there looking at him with that mixture of need and pride that is the hardest thing to sustain when you are hungry, pregnant, alone in a strange place, with no idea what comes next. There was in her a determination that Theo recognized, because it was the kind of determination that only appears when a person has nothing left to lose, but still has everything to protect. "What's your name?" he asked. "Catherine. Catherine Sue Whitfield." "Where are you coming from?" She hesitated just a second. "Harlan. But there's nothing left for me there." Theo was quiet. He looked at the belly. He looked at the canvas bag. He looked at her feet, swollen inside a pair of canvas sneakers that had seen better days. "The baby's father." "Out of the picture," she said, with a firmness that closed the subject. More silence. The wind moved in the leaves of the old oak trees by the road. A great white heron flew by high overhead, heading toward the creek. "Can you actually cook and clean?" he asked finally. "Yes, sir." "Any health problems besides the pregnancy?" "None. I'm healthy." Theo looked at Earl, who kept his expression neutral in the way of someone who has no intention of offering an opinion, but who already offered it when he went to get the boss. Then he looked at the sky, where the clouds were still piling up without raining, and then he looked back at Catherine. "There's a room in the back of the house. It's simple, but it's clean. You can stay until the baby is born and until you're able to work properly. We'll work out the details after that. But let's be clear from the start. You work for the roof and the food. I'm not in a position to pay wages right now." Catherine opened her mouth to respond, but her voice didn't come immediately. She had to swallow something that was lodged in her throat. It wasn't tears, it was relief, and sometimes relief hurts more than pain. "Thank you," she said at last. "You won't regret it." "I hope not," said Theo, and turned away because he didn't quite know what to do with what he was feeling. The back room was small, with a window that looked out on the yard where lemon trees grew and an old rose bush that nobody had pruned in years. It had a twin bed with a firm mattress, a 3-door wardrobe, a table with a mirror, and a chair. The floor was old hardwood, and the walls were white with a patch of damp in the upper right corner that looked like a map of an unknown island. Catherine walked in, set the bag on the bed, sat in the chair, and looked out the window at the flowerless rose bush. Miss Ruth Ann appeared at the door with a basin of warm water, a clean towel, and a plate with sliced cornbread and a mug of sweet tea. "Eat, honey," said the old woman, setting the plate on the table. "Eating when you're hungry isn't a sin. Sin is letting it pass." Catherine ate slowly, with the economy of someone who had learned that abundance can end and it's better to savor. The food was warm, the tea was sweet, the towel smelled of laundry soap. It is the small things that save us when everything falls apart, not the grand gestures, the small things. That night, lying on the firm mattress in the little back room with her enormous belly resting against the bed, Catherine prayed. She prayed the way she hadn't prayed since childhood, with that total surrender one only finds when there is nothing left to do but trust. She was grateful for the roof. She was grateful for the cornbread. She was grateful for the sweet tea. She was grateful for the serious, quiet man who had let her stay without asking questions that weren't his business. And she asked with all the strength she had left, that the child she carried inside her would have a different life than hers. A whole life, a life without the absences she had carried. In the days that followed, Catherine wove herself into the farm's routine with a discretion that Theo hadn't expected. She woke before Miss Ruth Ann, who had trouble with her joints in the mornings, and already had the coffee ready when the sun began to color the horizon. She swept the porch, shook out the rugs, washed the dishes, and still found time to help the old cook with the preparations for lunch. She did everything without complaint, without unnecessary noise, without invading spaces that weren't hers. Theo watched her from the corner of his eye without her noticing. He noticed the way she set the plates on the table with an almost ceremonial order, as if she wanted to show respect for the house that had taken her in. He noticed how she spoke with Miss Ruth Ann with a gentle patience, speaking slowly and loudly so the old woman could understand, without any impatience. He noticed, above all, the way she would sometimes stop what she was doing and place her hand on her belly, with that particular gesture of mothers who love before they have even seen the face. 2 weeks after Catherine arrived on a cold and rainy night, the baby decided to be born. Miss Ruth Ann was the one who heard the first sounds and roused the house. Theo called Earl, who called his wife Dottie, who had helped bring half the children in the county into the world and who arrived with a leather bag full of things Theo never wanted to know the names of. The ambulance was 40 minutes away on dirt roads, and the rain had closed the main road. There was no time. The baby was born at 3:20 in the morning, inside the little back room, with the rosebush outside the window rattling in the wind. He was born crying loudly, healthy, with a full head of dark hair and his eyes shut tight as though the world were a surprise he needed a moment to prepare for. Theo spent the whole time outside the room, sitting in the hallway with his elbows on his knees and his hands clasped, a position that was almost a prayer. When he heard the baby cry, he raised his head. Dottie opened the door and said, "It's a boy, they're both fine." And Theo felt something inside his chest that he didn't quite know how to name. It wasn't exactly joy. It was something larger than joy and more ancient, the primitive relief of knowing that life had won again. He entered the room with his cap in his hands, the way you visit someone important, which indeed he was. Catherine was lying down, exhausted, with the newborn on her chest. She looked at Theo with eyes that still carried the effort of the night, but that already shone with a different light, a deeper one that only appears when a person finds their own purpose in flesh and blood. "His name is Michael," she said. "I'm going to call him Michael." Theo looked at the baby, at the small, red, perfect face, at the tiny fingers closing in the air as though trying to grasp something that didn't yet exist. "Welcome, Michael," he said in a low voice, and he couldn't explain why the words came out with the same gravity and tenderness one uses when welcoming someone from one's own family. Michael grew up inside Good Hope as though he had been born belonging to it. And perhaps he had been born belonging to it truly, because there are places in the world that choose people just as much as people choose places, and Good Hope seemed to have been waiting for him. In the first months, the baby slept in the back room, in an improvised cradle that Earl had built from scrap wood without anyone asking him to, because the old foreman had these silent kindnesses that never needed thanks. Catherine nursed and cared and marveled with her eyes at every millimeter of that being who had come from her, as if she still couldn't believe he was real, as if she still feared that someone would come along and say it had been a mistake and take everything away. But the opposite happened. Michael kept growing and the farm kept waking up. It was hard to explain, and Earl tried once for his wife Dottie in the privacy of their bedroom. "It's that thing about babies, Dottie. A baby doesn't know the world can be ugly. A baby wakes up every day like it's the first day, and the people who live nearby get infected by that, you know. They start remembering that it's possible to start over." Theo, who needed to remember that it was possible to start over more than anyone, was the most affected. It started slowly. A smile at breakfast when Michael, at 3 months, began recognizing faces and smiling back at whoever came near. Then came the need to walk past the back room when he came in from the fields, with the excuse of getting something from the kitchen, but always stopping in the doorway to look at the baby sleeping or awake, or making those expressions of astonishment that babies make at the most ordinary things, a shadow, a sound, the changing light. At 4 months, Michael went into the yard for the first time in Catherine's arms, who held him carefully while pointing out the rose bush, the lemon tree, the red earth. At 6 months, he spent part of every afternoon on the porch, in a bouncy seat that Theo had gone to buy himself in town, because Catherine had mentioned at supper one evening that the baby liked to watch things move, and the next day the seat was there, without comment, as if it had appeared on its own. It was on the porch that everything changed. Theo came in from the fields one afternoon in May, tired, shirt soaked through with sweat, the red dust thick on his boots and forearms. Michael was in the bouncy seat on the porch, with Catherine beside him reading a worn paperback. When he heard Theo's footsteps on the wooden steps, the baby turned his head and, upon seeing the man, let out a sharp cry of joy, a cry that was more like a bird call than a human sound, and threw both small arms in his direction. Theo stopped. Catherine raised her eyes from the book and saw the man standing at the top of the steps, looking at her son with an expression she had never seen in him before. It was vulnerability. It was wonder. It was that specific moment when a heart that has been closed finds the crack where light begins to enter. He crossed the porch, bent down before the bouncy seat, and the baby seized one finger of that big, weathered hand with a strength disproportionate to the size of those little fingers. And they stayed like that. The large man bent over the tiny baby, connected by a finger, while the May sun dropped slowly behind the mountains. Catherine turned her eyes back to the book, but didn't read another word. Winter came dry, drier than expected, drier than the old-timers in the county could remember in the past 20 years. The clouds passed over without stopping, as if they were headed somewhere else, as if good hope wasn't part of the rain's plans. Earl looked at the sky every morning with the expression of someone waiting for a letter that never arrives. The farmhands talked among themselves quietly with that superstitious respect that country people have for drought. It's not exactly fear, it's recognition. It's knowing that there are forces larger than yourself and that before them you are small. The tobacco crop started showing signs in June. The leaves, which should have been broad and dark green, began taking on a yellowish pallor at the edges. Earl called Theo out to see, and the two stood between the rows of tobacco, smelling the soil, studying the leaves, examining the stalks with the silent gravity of doctors before a patient who cannot explain what he feels. "Blue mold," said Earl. "And there's black shank too. With this drought, the fungus spreads faster." Theo picked up a leaf, examined the underside, where the dark lesions of black shank had already spread like a map of ruins. "How much is affected?" "Right now, maybe 30–40% of the upper field, but if we don't treat fast with this drought, in 3 weeks it could be the whole crop." Treatment was expensive, the fungicide, the lime, the extra labor for application. Theo went to the bank, presented the plan, and heard from the loan officer a sentence that buzzed in his ears for days. "You already have an open line of credit, Mr. Drummond. Your borrowing margin is at its limit." He left the bank with less than he needed, but enough to begin treatment. The problem was that time didn't wait for the bank to decide. The black shank advanced faster than Earl had predicted, because the drought gave no quarter and the wind carried the spores across the fields with an efficiency that seemed almost malicious. By August, when the first good tobacco leaves should have been coming in, half the crop was compromised. The other half was in treatment, but that year's production would be a fraction of what had been expected. And then the cattle. The pastures, dried out from the lack of rain, had lost their nutritional value. The cattle started losing weight with a frightening speed. Theo bought hay from a neighboring farm, but the cost was eating through what remained of the reserves. With the credit line already at its limit and the tobacco crop compromised, the equation wouldn't balance. It was simple and it was brutal. The farm was bleeding, and the bleeding was faster than the ability to staunch it. Theo wasn't sleeping. He stayed up until the small hours on hot, dry nights, sitting in the office with the spreadsheets open on the desk, trying to find a number that fit, a solution he hadn't seen yet, an exit that didn't yet have a name. The numbers didn't lie. Numbers never lie. It's one of arithmetic's cruelties. It was on one of those nights that Catherine found him. She had gotten up to nurse Michael and, walking past the hallway, saw the office light still on. She knocked lightly on the door, which was ajar. "Can I come in?" Theo looked up. He had the look of a tired man, face worn, hair uncombed, several days of stubble. He looked older than he was. "Come on in," he said. Catherine entered with Michael in her arms, the baby already drifting back to sleep, heavy and warm as bread fresh from the oven. She pulled up a chair and sat across the desk without asking anything, without saying anything for a moment. Sometimes the best thing you can do for someone is simply be present without demanding any explanation. "Is it very bad?" she asked finally, with that quiet voice of someone who knows that the silence of night has a different quality, one that should be respected. "It's bad," he said, with an honesty that surprised him. He wasn't the type to talk about his problems. Real bad. And then, perhaps for the first time in a long time, perhaps because it was the middle of the night and the defenses come down in the middle of the night, perhaps because there was something in those dark eyes of hers that didn't judge, he told her. He talked about the tobacco crop, the black shank, the blue mold, the drought, the cattle losing weight, the maxed out credit, the bills that wouldn't balance. Catherine listened without interrupting. When he finished, she was quiet for a moment, adjusting Michael in her arms. "My daddy was a sharecropper," she said slowly. "I worked the fields from the time I was 8 years old. I don't know about spreadsheets and banks, but I know about land. And I know that land that was good once can be good again if someone doesn't give up on it." Theo looked at her. "I don't plan to give up," he said. "I know," she answered. "That's why I'm here." It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't an invitation. It was simply a statement. The two strangers whom fate had placed under the same roof were becoming, without having planned it, something resembling a team or a family. The two things sometimes are the same. September brought the Colonel. There was no warning. The Colonel didn't give warnings. He arrived when he felt like it, because the farm was his by inheritance in his mind, even if the papers said it was Theo's. He arrived in a large black car, a driver up front, a silver-handled cane in his hand, even though he didn't need the cane. It was more symbol than necessity, the materialization of the authority the old man needed to carry with him in order to keep being Colonel James Drummond wherever he set foot. He was 73 years old. White hair impeccably combed, a beige linen blazer, and that particular way of looking at what belongs to him, not with affection, but with assessment, as if at any moment he might decide the sale price. Theo received him on the porch with a formality that was equal parts respect and reserve. The two men embraced with the stiffness characteristic of a father and son who love each other, but don't know how to do it without it hurting. "You look like someone who isn't sleeping," was the first thing the Colonel said. "I'm fine, Dad. You're not. And the farm isn't either. I received the reports." Theo clenched his jaw, but said nothing. The Colonel entered the house, looked around with that inventory gaze, noticed the small changes: a new tablecloth in the dining room, flowers in a jar on the windowsill, a rubber toy in the corner of the sofa. He looked at his son with one eyebrow raised. "I heard you have people living here. An employee. She takes care of the house in exchange for lodging. Employee with a child?" The Colonel said the word child with a weight that wasn't neutral. "That's right. He was born here. The baby's name is Michael." "And the mother? Who is she?" "A young woman named Catherine. Hard-working, honest, and not the business of anyone else, Dad." The Colonel recognized the tone. It was the tone Theo used when he'd made a decision and wasn't open to revision. He chose to change the subject, for now. They spent the afternoon doing what the Colonel called an inspection, which consisted of walking the farm with Earl, cataloguing every problem, every bad number, every pessimistic projection, while the Colonel nodded and murmured comments that didn't quite form sentences, but had the weight of verdicts. At supper, Catherine served the pot roast, the mashed potatoes, the green beans with the seasoning she had learned to use the way Theo liked, without anyone asking. Earl was at the table too, as always on Fridays, by long-standing custom of the house. Michael was in the wooden playpen in the corner of the dining room, playing with an empty wooden spool, oblivious to the adult weight hanging over the table. The Colonel looked at Catherine with that silent assessment, then looked at Theo, then at Michael, and did a quick mental calculation in the way of a practical man. A calculation that wasn't necessarily wrong in its facts, but was entirely mistaken in its values. "Handsome boy," the Colonel said, looking at Michael, and the sentence could have been kind but wasn't, because underneath it was a question that hadn't been asked aloud, but had been asked nonetheless. "Thank you, sir," said Catherine without lowering her eyes. She knew how to recognize that kind of look. She had grown up receiving it. After supper, when Catherine had taken Michael to the bedroom and Earl had said his goodnights, the Colonel and Theo were left alone in the sitting room. The Colonel lit a cigar, a privilege Theo had never managed to ban inside his own house, and looked at his son with that expression that preceded what he called a serious talk. "Theo, I need you to understand the situation." "I understand the situation perfectly, Dad." "No, you don't." The Colonel drew on the cigar. "You have a bank loan coming due in December. The tobacco produced less than half of what was projected. The cattle are underweight. You can't make the payment. I already spoke with Mr. Garrett at the bank, and he was clear. If there's no significant cash infusion by December, they're going to call in the collateral." Theo knew all of this. He knew every comma of it. "I'm working on a solution, Dad." "What solution?" The Colonel tapped the cigar on the ashtray with an impatience as old as he was. "Are you going to grow money? Raise cattle on air?" "Theo, I warned you. I always warned you that you're too good a man to be a farmer. Running a farm takes toughness. It takes—" "Stop!" Theo said the word with a calm that was firmer than any shout. "I'm not going to sit here and listen to that tonight, Dad. If you have a concrete proposal, say it. If it's just to tell me I'm incompetent, I've heard it and don't need it repeated." The Colonel was quiet for a moment, caught off guard by his son's steadiness. Then he adjusted his blazer and said, "There is a proposal, yes." Pause. "William Hargrove, my business partner out of Atlanta, has a daughter, Annabelle, 32 years old, educated, well-established. He's willing to invest in the farm, capitalize the operation, pay off the bank loan, and add working capital in exchange for a formal partnership, and one additional condition." Theo looked at his father. "What condition?" "That you marry Annabelle." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences of that evening. It was the kind of silence that occupies the space of an explosion that hasn't happened yet. "You're asking me to marry a woman I don't know in order to save the farm." "It's not the first time marriages have been arranged for practical reasons, Theo. That's how it was with my father, with his father before him. Annabelle is a good woman from a good family." "No." Theo stood up. "This conversation is done for tonight, Dad. Theo, good night." In the days that followed, the proposal hung in the air like those August clouds, present, heavy, unresolved. The Colonel stayed 3 more days on the farm, during which he made a point of inspecting every corner, every account, every decision that had been made, with the declared aim of helping and the real effect of reminding Theo at every turn that the situation was grave and that there was an easy way out that he was refusing for reasons the Colonel considered pure sentimentality. Catherine noticed the tension. It would have been impossible not to. It was palpable in the air, in the way Theo became more closed in the days when his father was around, in the way the Colonel looked at her with that silent assessment that said, without words, that she was a problem to be solved. She didn't ask. It wasn't her business, that's what she told herself. She had learned early that other people's problems need an invitation before being touched, and Theo had never issued that invitation. She did her part. She took care of the house, took care of Michael, helped Miss Ruth Ann, and sometimes when the others were occupied, brought Theo his coffee in the office and set it on the desk without saying anything, because she knew there were moments when the silent presence of someone is worth more than any words. Theo, for his part, had begun to notice Catherine in a different way. It was hard to describe. It wasn't a lightning bolt, not that thing from the novels you feel in a fraction of a second. It was slower than that, more honest. It was like learning to see someone who had always been in front of your eyes, but was only now coming into clear focus. He noticed the way she talked to Michael, not with that artificial baby voice, but with a tender seriousness, as if her son were a complete person who deserved total respect, even though he couldn't yet speak. He noticed how she solved the household problems with a practical creativity and without drama. When the kitchen pipe started dripping, she didn't call a plumber. She asked Earl for a wrench and fixed it herself, with Michael in the playpen beside her, watching his mother work with those astonished eyes of someone learning how the world operates. He noticed her discipline, her dignity, the way she never complained about what she didn't have, and was grateful, with gestures, not words, for what she did. And in all of this, there was a quality that Theo recognized, because he had lost it when Eleanor left and thought he would not find it again. There was genuine goodness. Not the goodness of appearances, not the kindness of someone who knows they're being watched, but that goodness of character that shows up in invisible gestures. The glass of water she brought for Earl when the old man came through the kitchen with a dry throat without anyone asking. The mug of herbal tea she left on Miss Ruth Ann's table every night with the exact right amount of sugar that the old woman liked. The way she would hum softly to Michael in moments when the house was heavy, as if she wanted the music to fill the spaces where the air had grown difficult. The Colonel left on a Thursday morning with the proposal open in the air like an unanswered question. Before getting in the car, he pulled Theo aside. "Think hard, son. I'm not trying to hurt you. I never wanted anything but good for you. I just want the farm to survive." He paused and looked toward the kitchen window, where Catherine had briefly appeared before disappearing again. "And think too about what you're doing. That young woman is decent, I can see that. But she has a history. She has a child. She has a past. You need someone who will strengthen your position, not complicate it." Theo looked at his father with that expression the Colonel knew so well. Quiet eyes, firm jaw, the silent refusal that was, paradoxically, the thing most like himself that his son possessed. "Thank you for coming, Dad." The Colonel huffed, got in the car, and the car disappeared down the dirt road. Theo stood watching until the dust settled. October was the month things truly started to tighten. The bank notice arrived by certified mail, with the cold precision of documents that carry bad news in formal language, the outstanding balance, the due date, the default clauses, the collateral that could be seized. Theo read the letter 3 times, folded it carefully, put it in the desk drawer, and went to work in the fields, because that was what he knew to do when the problem was too large to be faced head-on. He worked, waited for the physical effort to somehow organize what was disorganized inside him. The farmhands noticed the weight on the boss's shoulders and worked more quietly than usual in those days, with the respect that country people have for another's hardship, which is different from pity. It is silent solidarity. It is doing your part without needing a speech. Earl went to the office one afternoon and placed an envelope on the desk. "What's this?" Theo asked. "My savings from the last several years," said the old man, with a voice that asked for no emotional response. "It's not much, but it's what I have." Theo looked at the envelope and felt something tighten in his throat. "Earl, I can't take this." "Yes, you can, boss. I got no family of my own. This farm is my family, and you're—" The old man paused, as if searching for the right words. "You're the son I never had, excuse me." And he left the office before Theo could say another word. The envelope sat on the desk. Theo stared at it for a long time. It was money that wouldn't solve the problem. It was a small fraction of what was needed, but it was an enormous fraction of something that goes beyond money. It was loyalty. It was love. It was proof that there are people in this world who stay when they could leave. 2 days later, Theo had to gather the farmhands and tell them he couldn't make the October payroll on time. He explained the situation with the honesty that had always been his way: the crop crisis, the drought, the loan. He said that whoever needed to go was free to leave, without hard feelings, and with a reference letter. He said that whoever stayed would have their wages honored as soon as things improved, and that while they were on the farm, they would have food and a roof guaranteed. Of the 7 hands, 5 stayed. Theo looked at those 5 men standing in the yard with their hats in their hands and felt a mixture of gratitude and shame that is one of the heaviest combinations there is. Because another person's generosity, when you're in difficulty, is one of the hardest things to receive with dignity. "Thank you," he said, and it was one of the few times in his life that the word had been too small for what it contained. It was on an afternoon in October that Theo called Catherine to the office. She came in with Michael on her hip, the baby now 8 months old, fat and curious, grasping his mother's fingers with a determination that made everyone laugh. She sat in the chair across from him with a neutral expression that poorly hid her unease, because when the boss calls you to the office with that kind of seriousness, it's rarely good news. Theo was direct. That was who he was. "The farm is in serious trouble, Catherine. You know that. Everyone here knows that. I can't make payroll, and some of the hands have already left." Pause. "I'm not in a position to keep you on. I can't pay you even minimum wage, and it wouldn't be fair to keep you in an arrangement that guarantees you nothing." Catherine looked at him steadily. Michael chattered on her lap, oblivious. "Where do you have to go?" he asked, because he needed to know before saying what he needed to say. He needed to know the size of what he was doing. She was quiet for a moment. "I have nowhere to go," she said, with the same direct honesty as the first time she had appeared at the gate. "My family sent me away when they found out about the pregnancy. I have no relatives who'd take me in with a baby. I have no savings. I have no job waiting for me anywhere." The brutal plainness of facts, spoken without ornament, without self-pity. Theo breathed deeply. "Then I would need to let me finish," she said, and there was a controlled urgency in her voice that made him go quiet. "I know you're in a tough spot. I know it wouldn't be fair to ask more than you can give, so I'm not asking for wages. I don't need money right now, I just need a place to stay and food for Michael. I'll work double in exchange. I'll do everything that needs doing in the house, help wherever I can on the farm, learn whatever I need to learn. I won't be a burden. I promise I won't." She paused. She looked at her son on her lap, then at Theo, and in that look was a courage that came at a high cost. Because asking is never easy. Asking with nothing to offer except your own labor and presence is even harder. And asking when you know you might be refused, and that if you are refused, you'll be on the road with nowhere to go, requires the kind of bravery that most people never have to find inside themselves. "Please," she said, "don't send me away." Theo looked at her for a time that seemed long but wasn't. Inside him, something that had been trying to close itself since she arrived had given up resisting. "Nobody's going to send you away," he said. "Stay. Both of you, stay." Catherine closed her eyes for a second. When she opened them, they were wet, but she didn't cry. She was not the type to let tears fall. She held them with that discipline of someone who knows that crying sometimes is a luxury the circumstances don't allow. "Thank you," she said. "No need to thank me," he said. "Get back to work." And for the first time in a very long time, there was a smile on Theo's lips that was not courtesy. It was real, small, almost shy, but it was genuine. What happened in the months that followed was something neither of them had planned, and that both of them, each in their own way, had resisted acknowledging. They became family. Not with ceremony, not with declarations, not with the grand gestures that novels celebrate, with the small, constant things that are, in fact, the bricks with which anything lasting is built. Theo started having supper at the table with Catherine and Michael instead of in the office alone, as he had done for 3 years. It began because one evening Catherine had come to the office with his plate and said simply, "The food gets cold in here. The table's set in the dining room." And there was something in the way she said it, not as an order, not as a request, but as a statement of fact, that Theo didn't know how to refuse. He went to the table, and he stayed. Michael, at 9 months, had discovered that he could crawl across the floor with a speed and determination that terrified everyone in the house. He explored the porch, the kitchen, the sitting room, invariably arriving near everything he shouldn't. The stove, the steps, the chicken pen. He required a constant vigilance that distributed itself naturally among the adults of the house, so that Theo found himself, almost without noticing, taking on part of that role, catching the boy before he reached the edge of a step, steering him away from sharp stones in the yard, sitting on the porch floor so Michael could use him as a particular and exclusive mountain to climb. There was a specific afternoon that Catherine never forgot. She was in the yard, hanging clothes on the line, when she heard laughter coming from the porch. 2 laughs, one small and high, one deep and low. She left the wet laundry in the basket and went to look. Theo was sitting on the porch floor, cross-legged, with Michael in front of him, and the two were engaged in a specific game. Theo would put a beat-up old baseball cap on his head. Michael would knock it off. Theo would put it back on. Michael would knock it off again, and so on, with a repetition of absolutely no purpose, but of total joy. The man she had found closed as a locked door was sitting on the floor with a lopsided baseball cap on his head, laughing a full, honest laugh, letting a 10-month-old baby govern him completely, and he looked, in that moment, freer than in any other she had witnessed. She didn't go to the porch. She stayed in the hallway, watching, with wet laundry dripping from her hand, and felt something shift inside her chest that was dangerous and real. It wasn't gratitude. Gratitude she already had, plenty of it. It was something else. It was the thing you try not to feel when you know that feeling is complicated, when you know you're too vulnerable, when you know you've already been abandoned once, and that abandonment left marks that still ache on the edge of rain. She went back to the yard and hung the laundry in silence, with great care, as if the task required total concentration. Theo, for his part, had his own moments of uncomfortable awareness. When Catherine came to the field with Michael in a baby carrier and a bowl of cold watermelon for the hands on a hot afternoon, and he watched her from a distance distributing the slices with a smile that went to everyone without distinction, and thought, when did this woman become part of the landscape of this farm, the same way the oak trees and the tobacco rows did? When did the idea of her not being here start to feel wrong? He said nothing. There was nothing to say. The situation was complicated. The farm was in crisis. His father had planted that proposal, which would rot inside him if he let it, and he had no right to complicate still further the life of a woman whose life had already been so complicated by circumstance. But feelings have their own democracy. They don't ask permission, and they don't respect inconvenience. It was Miss Ruth Ann who heard it first, because the nearly deaf, paradoxically, are the ones who pay the most attention to what's around them, since they cannot depend on their ears. The old woman pulled Earl aside and said, in that loud, direct voice of someone who feels no need to whisper, "Earl, those two are going to fall in love if somebody doesn't help them realize they already are." Earl looked at his wife, Dottie, who was doing some sewing nearby, and the two older women exchanged a glance that contained the accumulated wisdom of decades of observing human nature. "We don't interfere, Ruth Ann. We let it be." "Ah, Earl." The old woman shook her head. "Men." In November, a letter arrived from Nashville with the Colonel's law firm letterhead. Theo opened it in the office, alone, with his coffee going cold beside him. It was 3 pages. The first described the farm's financial situation with a precision that Theo recognized as that of someone who had hired an accountant to do the analysis. The Colonel was meticulous. The second formally presented the proposal. Mr. William Hargrove would invest the amount necessary to pay off the bank loan and capitalize the farm's operation, receiving a 40% partnership stake, conditional on the marriage between Theo and his daughter Annabelle within 6 months. The third page was a personal note from his father, written by hand in that firm, angular handwriting of the Colonel's. "Theo, I know you'll think I'm pressuring you. I'm not. This is the only way out I can see. I've known William for 30 years. He's a man of his word, and Annabelle is a good woman who will do right by you. You've been alone for 3 years, son. That's too long. The farm needs you whole, and you haven't been whole since Eleanor left. Think hard. The deadline for a response is 30 days. With love, your father." Theo folded the 3 pages, put them back in the envelope, and sat looking out the office window at the tobacco field beginning to recover. Slowly, with that green stubbornness that life has when it decides it's not going to give up. The proposal was real, the deadline was real, and the solution was simple from a mathematical standpoint. Accept and save the farm, or refuse and lose it. But there were variables that fit on no spreadsheet. There was a baby who laughed when he walked into the room. There was a pair of dark eyes that sometimes looked at him in a way that made him feel truly seen, not assessed. There was a presence that had transformed the silent farmhouse into a home. There was Catherine. Theo didn't respond to the letter for 5 days. In those 5 days, he worked, had supper, played with Michael, and at night sat in the office with the envelope in the drawer like a physics problem he knew had a solution, but couldn't find without cost. On the 6th day, Catherine was in the kitchen peeling potatoes when he came in and stood in the doorway. "You got a minute?" She looked up from the potatoes. She saw his expression. Of course. He came in, pulled up a stool, sat. For a moment he was quiet, hands between his knees. "My father made me a proposal," he said, and he told her. Not everything. He didn't say there were feelings involved, didn't say what was growing inside him. He told her the proposal objectively, the investment, the partnership, the condition of the marriage. Catherine listened without interrupting. The potatoes sat in the bowl. She was still, with that specific stillness of someone processing something that hurts. "And are you going to accept?" she asked when he finished. "I'm thinking about it," he said. She nodded slowly, looked at the potatoes, started peeling again with mechanical gestures. "It makes sense," she said, with a voice that was carefully controlled. "It's the logical way out." "Catherine, you don't need to explain," she said, and then in a quieter voice, "I understand. I really do." Theo sat looking at her, at the hands peeling potatoes with a precision that was effort disguised as normalcy, at the line of her shoulders, slightly curved, at her neck where a vein pulsed faster than it should, but he said nothing more. He got up from the stool and left the kitchen. Catherine waited until she heard his footsteps disappear down the hallway. Then she stopped peeling. She sat looking at the bowl of cloudy water where potato peels floated like fragments. It was exactly this. It was exactly what always happened. She arrived, she stayed, she built, and then someone decided she didn't fit in the frame that had been planned for a place. It was her mother saying a pregnant daughter with no husband was too much shame. It was her father saying she'd made her bed. Now, lie in it. It was Michael's father vanishing the week the test came back positive. And now it was this good man, this man who had been kinder to her than anyone in the past 2 years, who was sitting in her kitchen with a proposal in hand and the expression of someone still weighing the cost of his options. The crying didn't come. She didn't let it. She picked Michael up from the playpen, carried him to the bedroom, sat on the edge of the bed with her son in her lap, and stayed there, quiet, while he slept, looking at the rosebush in the yard through the window. The rosebush had bloomed in October, the first pink flowers in years after Catherine had started pruning and feeding it in the late afternoons. There were flowers on the rosebush now, but winter was coming. That night, Catherine did not sleep. She lay awake, listening to the farm, the crickets, the wind in the old pine trees, the distant cry of some animal in the field. She thought about where she would go. Not because Theo had said she was leaving. He hadn't said anything. But she knew how to recognize the signs. She knew the difference between a man who is still choosing and a man who has already chosen but hasn't said so yet. She began, mentally, to do the accounting that anyone does when they are once again facing the abyss. What she had, what she didn't have, what the real possibilities were. She didn't have enough money for a month's rent anywhere. She had no support network. She had a baby of 10 months who was still nursing. She had her hands and her willingness to work. She also had, more than when she had arrived, more resilience. She had arrived broken. She had recovered, not completely, never completely, because there are breaks that leave permanent marks, but enough to be standing, to be functional, to know that she had survived what she thought she wouldn't. "We'll be all right," she said to Michael, sleeping. "We always are." The baby murmured in his dream and flexed his fingers. "I promise," she said, and she believed it more or less in what she was promising. The following morning, very early, when there was still frost on the pastures and the sun was just a golden line on the horizon, Earl found Theo standing in the middle of the tobacco field. The old foreman approached slowly, in that way he had of arriving without disturbing. "Boss." "Earl." The two stood looking at the tobacco field. The plants that had been treated were already showing signs of recovery, new growth at the tips of the stalks, the surviving leaves hardening. It was little, it was late, but it was something. "You know," said Earl finally, in that low and steady voice, "I worked for your grandfather, then for your father, and now for you. 38 years on this land." Pause. "In all that time I've seen a lot. Drought, pestilence, death, joy. I've seen this farm bloom and I've seen it wither. And I learned something that took me a long time to understand when I was young, but that I know for certain now." "What's that?" asked Theo. "That a farm without love produces nothing that's worth anything." The old man looked at him with those small, precise eyes, and that what gives life to a piece of land isn't money, it's whoever tends it. Theo was quiet. "I'm not talking about the farm, boss." "I know," said Theo. "Excuse me." And Earl walked away among the tobacco plants, leaving Theo alone with the rising sun and with the truth the old man had spoken without mentioning any names. It was on the afternoon of that same day that Michael's fever began. Catherine noticed first. The baby had been quieter than usual since lunch. Not the quiet of sleep, but the quiet of when something is wrong. That specific silence that mothers recognize before there's any measurable physical sign. Because there is a language between mother and child that needs no words and no thermometer. She put the palm of her hand on his forehead. It was hot. Very hot. She got the thermometer from the dresser drawer and it read 102.4. She gave him a lukewarm bath, gave him the fever reducer that Miss Ruth Ann kept in the kitchen cabinet, and waited. In half an hour the fever dropped to 101. But the boy was limp, with that glazed look of someone who is truly ill. Different from the ordinary fever that makes them irritable and crying, he was quiet. And too quiet in a 10-month-old baby was more frightening than any amount of crying. Miss Ruth Ann arrived, looked, felt his head, felt his abdomen. "Does it hurt here?" she asked, pressing gently on the baby's belly. Michael whimpered. The two women exchanged a look. "He needs a doctor," said Miss Ruth Ann. "Today." The nearest urgent care was 20 miles away on dirt roads. The doctor there only took appointments on Tuesdays and Thursdays. It was Monday. The nearest hospital was in the county seat, 45 miles away. Theo's car was at the mechanic's since the previous week with an alternator problem. Earl's truck had a flat tire since morning. Catherine picked Michael up and went to Theo's office with an urgency she tried to control but couldn't entirely conceal. "Michael has a high fever and pain in his belly," she said. "He needs a doctor today. It can't wait until tomorrow." Theo stood up immediately. He went to the bedroom with her, crouched beside the bed where Catherine had laid the boy, and looked at him. At the half-closed eyes, at the breathing that seemed a little fast, at the expression of suffering that should not be on a face so small. He put his hand on the baby's forehead. "He's very hot." 104 now, said Catherine. It went back up even with the medicine. Theo stood. He looked out the window at the garage where the car sat useless, then at the sky where the sun was going down. It was almost 4 in the afternoon, and with darkness would come more cold, and the 45 miles of dirt road would be harder in the night. "Earl," he called, with a voice that cut through the afternoon quiet like a blade. The foreman appeared in the hallway in seconds. "The car's at the shop, and the truck has a flat. How long to change the tire?" "An hour, at least." "The spare's not in great shape either, boss." Theo processed the information in seconds. "Saddle Thunder." Catherine looked at him. "You're going on horseback? It's 45 miles. Thunder can do it in under 2 hours at a gallop." He was already in the hallway, heading to the bedroom for his jacket. "I'll get to town, find Dr. Calloway or go to the ER, explain the situation, and bring someone back or call for an ambulance. Earl, while I'm gone, change the tire on the truck." He stopped and turned to Catherine. "Cold compresses on the forehead, the neck, the armpits. Fever reducer every 6 hours. Call me on my cell every 30 minutes. "Theo," she said, and it was the first time she'd used his name without the sir, without the title, just the name. And he stopped. "Be careful." There were 3 simple words, but they carried so much of what simple words sometimes carry. Worry, affection, the implicit fear of someone who doesn't want to lose more than she has already lost. Theo looked at her for just a second. 1 second only. "I will," he said, and he was gone. Thunder was a 5-year-old chestnut quarter horse, tall, muscular, with a gait that made the ground vibrate. Theo had bought him 2 years before and trained him with the patience he devoted to all things that deserved patience. The horse was fast. The fastest in the county, said the men who knew horses, and Theo had never needed to prove it in any real emergency. Until now. He set off down the main road at a trot and broke into a gallop as soon as the way opened up. The afternoon was cooling, the wind whipped his face, and the red dust of the road was left behind in clouds that the setting sun turned orange. Theo bent low over the horse's neck, hands firm on the reins, heels pressed in, feeling the powerful rhythm of the hooves hammering the dry earth. He thought of Michael, of the small face with that expression of pain, of the glazed eyes, so different from the astonished, alive eyes of always. And he thought of Catherine, of how alone she was back there, with her sick child, no car, no easy way out, depending on him. There was a clarity out there in the gallop that rarely exists in closed rooms where important decisions are made. The things that were essential became sharp when everything else, the spreadsheets, the debts, his father's proposal, the farm, the titles and collateral, was left behind in the dust of the road. What was essential was simple. There was a sick baby he loved as a son. There was a woman who had arrived with a canvas duffel bag and had brought life back to a place that had lost its own. And he was galloping toward town, not because he was obligated to, not because it was convenient, but because there was nothing else in the world he wanted to do in that moment except solve this specific problem for these specific people. It was love. He knew it was love. He had known it before giving it a name. But now, with the wind in his face and the horse eating the distance, the name was clear as the horizon ahead. He reached town with the sun already below the mountains, thunder covered in sweat, both of them breathing hard. He went straight to Dr. Calloway's office, family doctor, trusted, who had cared for the entire region for 20 years. The office was closed, but the doctor's house was next door. He knocked with urgency. The doctor's wife opened the door, startled by the man's appearance, sweaty, dusty, hat in hand, and an urgency in his eyes that could not be ignored. "Dr. Calloway, please. It's urgent." The doctor appeared in 2 minutes with his bag on his arm. Theo explained in 30 seconds. 10-month-old baby, high fever, abdominal pain, fever reducer wasn't controlling it. Dr. Calloway didn't need to hear more. "We'll take my car. You can put the horse in my neighbor's stable." The return trip took 40 minutes, with Dr. Calloway driving fast on the darkened road, the headlights opening the night, Theo in the passenger seat with his phone in hand, receiving Catherine's updates at each interval. "Fever, up to 104.2. He's crying when I move his belly on the right side." The doctor heard and kept a serious expression. "Could be appendicitis. It's rare in babies that young, but it happens. Could also be a serious intestinal infection. Either way, we need to assess and probably transfer to the hospital." "The nearest hospital is in Knoxville," said Theo. "I know. Let's see what we're dealing with first." They arrived at the farm a little after 8. Catherine had the door open before the car had fully stopped, with Michael in her arms, her face white with worry, but her voice controlled when she greeted the doctor. Dr. Calloway examined Michael with the calm thoroughness that experienced doctors have, which is not indifference but competence, the thing most resembling charity that medicine offers. He palpated the belly, checked the reflexes, assessed hydration, examined the eyes, the ears. Catherine stood beside him, motionless, her hands pressed together. Theo stood in the doorway, because there wasn't room for him inside the bedroom, but he also couldn't go any farther. The doctor turned to both of them. "It's not appendicitis," he said, and Catherine closed her eyes for a second of relief that lasted briefly because he continued, "But it is a serious bacterial infection. The abdomen is inflamed, and the high fever tells us his body is fighting hard. We need intravenous antibiotics and monitoring. The local clinic doesn't have the facilities. He needs to go to the hospital in Knoxville." "When?" asked Catherine. "Now," said the doctor. "And do you?" They went in Dr. Calloway's car, Catherine in the back with Michael on her lap, Theo up front beside the doctor. The night was cold and moonless, the road cut through the dark between mountains like a thread, and inside the car was the tense silence of people who are waiting and praying at the same time. Catherine prayed softly, her lips moving almost imperceptibly, her hand on her son's warm chest feeling the breathing. Present, present, present. Each breath was an answer. Each breath was a small and total miracle. Theo turned once and saw her praying. He said nothing. He turned back to the road and prayed too, in his way, without formed words, only with that inner surrender that is more prayer than any memorized verse. "Let him stay, please. Let him stay." The hospital in Knoxville received Michael at the emergency entrance. Nurses with efficient faces and gentle voices, the white fluorescent light of the emergency hallway, the smell of alcohol and disinfectant that is the universal scent of the place where you go when things are serious. Catherine went in with her son. Theo stayed in the waiting room because only family could enter. And he stayed. He sat in that hard plastic chair among other anxious faces from other stories he didn't know, and waited. He waited with his hands between his knees, elbows on his thighs, looking at the beige granite floor of the hallway without really seeing anything. Dr. Calloway stayed for a while, completed the necessary handoffs with the local team, and before leaving, because he had patients and appointments early in the morning, stopped in front of Theo and said, "The boy is in good hands, and he has good odds. He's strong, that baby. Thank you, doctor, for everything." The doctor looked at him with those old eyes that had seen so much. You galloped 45 miles for a son. Pause. Your son. It wasn't a question. Theo opened his mouth to make the distinction that was technically true, that Michael was not biologically his son. But the words wouldn't come. Because it was a lie, not on paper. On paper there was no relationship at all. But in the place where true things live, in the heart, in the action, in what a person does when life demands a choice with no time to think, Michael was his son. He had been, perhaps, from the first night he had heard him cry, and felt that primitive relief. He had been since the porch with the baseball cap. He had been from the beginning. "Yes," said Theo, "my son." Catherine returned from the pediatric ward 2 hours later with the face of someone who has just been through the biggest fright of their life and is still processing that the fright ended well. "He's stabilizing," she said, standing before Theo, who had jumped to his feet the moment he saw her. "The fever came down. The antibiotics are working. They'll monitor through the night, but the doctor said if it keeps up like this, they'll probably discharge him tomorrow afternoon." Theo closed his eyes for a second. "Thank God," he said. And it was genuine. It was the most honest thing he had expressed in a long time. Catherine looked at him. She had red-rimmed eyes from a night of fright and contained tears. She had a wrinkled shirt and hair that had escaped entirely from the clip, loose and disheveled around her face. She was, objectively, in one of her worst physical states of the past several months, and Theo found her the most beautiful thing he had ever seen. "You can go home," she said, with that voice trying to be practical. "You don't need to stay. It's far. It's late. You have the farm." "Catherine," she stopped. He was standing before her in the hospital hallway, with the road dust still on his clothes, his hair wind-blown from the gallop, his eyes with that expression she had learned to recognize. Not the closed expression, not the calculating or guarded expression, but that other one, rarer, that appeared when he was being completely honest. "I'm not going home," he said. "I'll stay here all night if I have to. Not because I feel obligated. Because I want to. Because he is..." He paused for the briefest moment, the pause of someone taking a breath before saying something they know will change everything. "Because he is like a son to me, and you." He stopped. Catherine waited still. "And you are." He rubbed the back of his neck with his hand, a gesture of discomfort that was the most human thing she had seen from him. "You are the reason that house became a home again. And I have been a fool to stay quiet for so long when I should have said that earlier. But I'm saying it now, even here in a hospital hallway covered in road dust, because apparently that's how I do things." There was an involuntary humor in the last sentence, and Catherine felt the corners of her lips rise in spite of everything. In spite of the fright, in spite of the exhaustion, in spite of all the walls she had built with such effort in the years before. "You don't have to say this just because Michael got sick," she said, because she had to test it, because she had learned the hard way that beautiful words spoken in moments of crisis don't always survive the moment. "I'm not saying it because of the scare," he said. "I'm saying it because it's been true longer than I admitted to myself. And because tonight showed me that waiting for the perfect moment is a waste." Pause. "But if you don't feel the same way, stay quiet and I'll understand, and nothing will change." Catherine looked at him for a long moment. At the honest, dusty man in the cold hospital hallway, who had galloped 45 miles out of love, not obligation, not convenience, love, and who was now standing before her with the vulnerability of someone who has put everything on the table and is waiting to see what life decides. "You are very hard to love, you know that?" she said finally. He frowned. "Why?" "Because you're quiet and closed off, and you never say what you're feeling, and sometimes you go days without looking me in the eyes." She paused. but it's impossible not to love you. I tried. It didn't work." Theo was quiet for a second that seemed very long. Then slowly he extended his hand. Catherine looked at the extended hand, large, calloused, marked by work, and placed hers inside it. They stood like that in the hospital hallway, hand in hand, while the clock on the wall marked past midnight, and while inside, in a monitored ward with attentive nurses, Michael slept with his fever coming down and life winning the battle that had been presented to it. Michael was discharged the following afternoon at noon, as the doctor had predicted. He left the hospital in Catherine's arms, with Theo beside her, and when the cool outside air hit the baby's small face, he sneezed. A small, loud sneeze that made both of them laugh at the same time, with that laugh of relief and affection that is one of the best things there is. The return was different from the drive there. In the back seat of Earl's truck, which Earl had driven to Knoxville once the tire was changed, Catherine sat with Michael on her lap, Theo beside her, not in front with Earl, but beside her, close enough that she could feel the warmth of his arm against hers, and the silence inside the truck was a different kind of silence. It was the silence of people who had been through a fright and were on the other side, more whole than before. Earl drove with the serene expression of someone who saw nothing, heard nothing, and is perfectly aware of everything. Back at the farm, Miss Ruth Ann was on the porch waiting with a pot of chicken soup on the stove, because she had decided, with the absolute authority of wise old people, that chicken soup cures everything, and that even if it doesn't cure everything, at least it warms you, and warming someone is always a good start. Michael was received with that discreet commotion characteristic of people who don't know easily how to show emotion, but feel it strongly. Earl carried the bags. Miss Ruth Ann touched the baby's head with the palm of her hand and said, "Thank the Lord," 3 times, quietly, as though completing a ritual. The hands who had stayed appeared in the yard with hats in hand, for no specific reason, simply to see that everything was all right. Catherine looked at them, those people who were not her family by blood, but who had become her family by life, and felt a gratitude that was larger than any words she could find. She put Michael in the crib that Earl had moved to the main bedroom during their absence, without asking, without permission, on his own initiative, because the old man had decided it was time. Theo saw the crib and looked at the foreman. Earl shrugged with an expression of innocence that fooled nobody. Then 2 days later, with Michael recovered and playing in the playpen with renewed energy, as if the fright had only increased his vitality, Theo called Catherine to the porch after supper. It was a November night, warm and full of stars. The breeze brought the smell of the tobacco field in recovery, that specific fragrance of tobacco leaves touched by the irrigation water Theo had ordered installed with the last of the resources. They sat on the porch steps, as they had done other times, without realizing it had become a habit. "I need to tell you something about my father," said Theo. "I know about the proposal," she said. He turned to her. "You know? I overheard Earl mention it to Miss Ruth Ann. I wasn't trying to eavesdrop." She looked at the yard. "I understand it's the most sensible way out, Theo. And you don't owe me anything. I want you to know that." "Catherine, let me finish." She raised her hand slightly. "You were good to me from the first day. You gave me dignity when I had none left. You were a father to Michael when he had none. And I don't intend to use that as leverage, because that wouldn't be fair. You have a farm your grandfather built that needs to survive. That matters. It's real. And a woman with no past and a baby with no father can't compete with that." There was a nobility in those words that came at a high cost, the nobility of someone who gives up before being asked, to preserve the dignity of the person across from them. Theo sat looking at her for a long moment. "Are you done?" he asked, with that calm that sometimes seemed like coldness, but wasn't. "I'm done," Then listen." He turned fully toward her with that gravity he used for things that mattered. "I am not going to marry Annabel Hargrove. I am not going to marry anyone I didn't choose. It wasn't that way with Eleanor, and it won't be that way now. But the farm is my responsibility. I'll find another way." Pause. "I already have, actually." She looked at him. "I called Mr. Garrett at the bank and proposed a restructure. I showed him the recovery plan for the tobacco crop, the irrigation numbers, the projections for the next season." Theo breathed deeply. Yesterday he called back. They approved the restructure. The deadline has been extended by 18 months, with a 6-month grace period on payments. It's tight, but it's possible. Catherine was quiet. "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I didn't want to say anything until I knew it would work." Pause. "And because there was something else I needed to sort out first, something more important than the bank." "What?" Theo was quiet for a moment, looking at the stars as though searching for the words in a map written up there. 3 years ago, when Eleanor died, I shut down. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was as if the whole house, the house and I, had decided it was safer to be empty than to be full and lose again." Pause. "And then you showed up with a canvas bag and a huge belly and an absurd kind of courage, and little by little you started filling the house back up, without asking permission, without realizing you were doing it." He looked at her. "And I tried not to see it. I pretended I wasn't seeing it. But you can't pretend forever when the thing is real." Catherine's eyes were bright, but she wasn't crying. There was that characteristic restraint of hers, that self-discipline that was self-respect. "I'm afraid," she said with direct honesty. "I've been left behind in different ways by people I loved. My family, Michael's father. I've learned that loving means risking, and that risking hurts." "I know," he said. "I'm afraid too. Anyone who isn't has never truly loved." Pause. "But there are things worth the risk." Another pause. "You are worth the risk. Michael is worth the risk." One final pause. "I know I don't have much to offer right now except a farm in crisis and a heart that's learning to work again. But what I have for real. And if you want it, it's yours." The silence that followed was different from all the other silences in this story. It was the silence of two people who arrived, each by their own road, at the same place, at the same time, and are recognizing it. Catherine looked at his hands, resting on his knees. "You know that with Michael and me, life's going to be messy, right?" she said. "A baby wakes up at night, makes messes, doesn't respect anybody's schedule." "I know," he said, and there was the beginning of a smile. "And that I'm stubborn, and when I think I'm right, I don't back down easily. I've noticed. And that I have no family, no dowry, no important last name. None of that interests me." "Why not?" "Because what you have," he said with that simple and direct honesty that was his mark, "is enough. It's more than enough." Catherine was quiet for a moment. Then she laid her head on his shoulder, slowly, with that gesture that is more intimacy than anything. Not a kiss, not a declaration, just your head on the shoulder of someone you trust, which is perhaps the truest form of love there is. Theo was still for a second, as if unsure of what to do. Then he put his arm around her, slowly, carefully, like someone holding something precious. And they stayed like that on the porch steps, with the smell of the tobacco field on the breeze, the stars of the Tennessee night multiplied above them, and inside the house, Michael sleeping with that deep and peaceful breathing of healthy babies who don't know it's a miracle to breathe, but it is. Colonel James Drummond arrived in December for the answer he had requested. Theo received him in the office. On the desk sat the documentation of the bank restructuring, the detailed recovery plan, the projections for next season with the tobacco crop in treatment. The colonel sat, took the papers, read them. He read everything with that meticulous attention that was, despite everything, a quality that Theo had inherited from him. For a long time, he was quiet. "This is viable," said the Colonel finally, with the voice of someone who expected to have to argue and instead found an answer he hadn't anticipated. "It is," said Theo. "Tight. It is, but it's honest, and it's mine." The Colonel set the papers on the desk and looked at his son. "Annabelle, Dad." Theo said the word with a respect and a firmness that coexisted without contradiction. "I'm not going to marry Annabelle, not because she isn't a good woman, she probably is, but because I don't love her, and because I love someone else." The Colonel was silent. "The girl, Catherine, yes." More silence. The Colonel looked out the office window at the yard, where outside Catherine could be seen sitting on the porch steps with Michael on her lap, pointing at the old oak trees and talking to the baby with that tender seriousness she used for everything important. "She has nothing," said the Colonel, not cruelly, but with the pragmatism that was his mode of being. "She has everything that matters," said Theo. The Colonel turned to his son. He looked at that face he had carried since birth, that he had watched grow, that he had tried to mold in his own image without ever quite succeeding. And perhaps that was exactly why the son had turned out right, had become a real man. Because he had resisted where he needed to resist. There was something in that moment that was pride, even though the Colonel would never use the word. "She knows you're in debt?" "She knows. And she stays anyway. She stayed when I told her I couldn't even pay her wages. She stayed for nothing, Dad, for food and a roof for her son." The Colonel was quiet for a long time. "A decent man," he said finally, in a voice slightly lower than usual, "spends his whole life learning to recognize what has value." Pause. "Looks like you learned faster than I did." It was the closest thing to a blessing that Colonel James Drummond had given in many years. Theo said nothing. He didn't need to. The Colonel had supper with them that evening. He sat at the table with Theo, Catherine, Earl, and Miss Ruth Ann, and with Michael in the playpen in the corner of the dining room, who, upon seeing the unknown and imposing man in the beige blazer, sat studying him with that baby gaze that is pure assessment without filter. The Colonel, who had raised children with the rigidity he thought necessary and who had fallen short on tenderness by believing tenderness was weakness, looked at the baby, and the baby looked back with the total frankness of those who haven't yet learned to hide what they feel. And then Michael smiled, that wide, gum-filled smile, for absolutely no apparent reason, the kind of smile that dismantles defenses that take decades to build. The Colonel sat looking at that smile for a second, then, slowly, like something that hadn't happened in a long time and needed to remember how it worked, he smiled back. Catherine saw this from across the table and looked back down at her plate, because there are things that aren't yours to witness. They are intimacies between an old man and a baby who were, without knowing it, beginning something. "What's the boy's name?" asked the Colonel, in a slightly different voice. "Michael," said Catherine. "Michael," repeated the Colonel, and he nodded as if in approval. "Good name. Strong." The next season's harvest was small, but it was honest. The tobacco that had survived the blight and the treatment produced less than in the good years, but more than enough to meet the first installment of the bank restructuring and to pay the hands who had stayed their back wages. Theo settled every cent he owed Earl. The old man refused twice, accepted on the third asking because Theo had said, "Earl, if you don't take it, I'll be embarrassed for the rest of my life, and you don't want that." The foreman took the money, folded it carefully, put it in the pocket of his flannel shirt and said, "With this money, I'm going to buy a new mattress for me and Dottie. Ours has been begging for mercy for years." Miss Ruth Ann, who was in the doorway listening, said, "Well, it's about time." and went back to the kitchen. Theo proposed to Catherine on a morning in February, when the tobacco field was showing the first signs of new growth, the small, pale green shoots emerging from the earth like a quiet decision to begin again. There was no ring. He had gone to the jeweler in town and stood for half an hour looking at the options, until the salesman had asked if he needed help, and Theo had said, with an honesty the salesman probably hadn't expected, "I don't know her ring size, I don't know what she'd want, and anything I pick without asking is going to be the wrong choice." The salesman was quiet for a moment, and then smiled, because he was a man who had seen many grooms and had recognized in that moment that the dusty man before him was doing things the right way. He came back without a ring, and he said to Catherine that morning, out in the recovering tobacco field, with Michael in the baby carrier on her chest, asleep against the warmth of his mother, "I wanted to ask you something." "What is it?" she asked, looking at the new shoots. "I'd like you to marry me." Catherine was quiet for a moment. She looked at him, at the field, at Michael sleeping, at the February sky that had finally relented and was bringing the first rains after 2 years of drought. The rain was falling fine and warm, and the smell of wet earth was, in that moment, the most beautiful smell in the world. "Are you sure?" she asked. Not from insecurity. It was the kind of question you ask when the answer matters too much to let pass without verification. "More certain than I am of anything else," he said. She stood looking at him with those dark eyes that had carried so much and that had slowly, over those months, grown lighter. Not because life had grown easier, but because they had found a shoulder that bore things together. "Yes," she said. "I'll marry you." Theo pulled her close, carefully, because there was a baby sleeping between them, and because he was always careful with fragile things, and held her there in the recovering tobacco field with the fine February rain falling on the three of them. Michael woke from the movement, looked around with that just woken expression of astonishment, saw Theo's face close to his, and let out the trill that was his signature, his particular laugh, his way of saying what he didn't yet have words to say. The whole field seemed to breathe. The wedding was simple because that was who they were, in the little chapel on the farm, built by Theo's grandfather, and carrying in its field stone walls the weight of all the prayers of all the generations who had passed through it, on a March morning with a sky of such pure blue it seemed painted. Catherine wore a white dress of simple cut that Miss Ruth Ann had helped her choose in town, with flowers from the yard in her hair, roses from the rose bush in the yard, which had bloomed in abundance that year, as if it too had been waiting for this moment to give its best. Theo wore the suit he had bought for his wedding to Eleanor, and never worn since. There was a moment while getting dressed when he stopped in front of the mirror with the suit hanging beside him and thought of Eleanor. Not with guilt, not with betrayal, but with that reverent gratitude that is the most honest way to honor someone you have loved. Thank you for what was. Thank you for what you taught me. Thank you for having passed through my life in a way that made me able to recognize when something good came along. He put on the suit. He walked out of the bedroom. Earl was in the sitting room, in his Sunday blazer and polished shoes, with an expression that was contentment disguised as neutrality. Miss Ruth Ann was beside him in a floral dress, with a handkerchief in her hand that was not decorative. It was essential, because she already knew she was going to cry. The 5 hands who had stayed were outside, clean and dressed up with their wives and children, forming a spontaneous row along the path to the chapel, as if they had arranged it without having arranged anything. Colonel James Drummond was seated in the front pew of the chapel in his usual grey suit, the silver-handled cane propped beside him. When Theo entered, his father looked at him and made an almost imperceptible gesture with his head, a minimal nod that in 30 years of difficult and honest relationship, Theo had learned to recognize as the closest the colonel came to saying, "I am proud of you." Catherine entered through the chapel door with Michael on her hip, because there was no one to walk her down the aisle, but there was the person she loved more than anyone, and it was with him she wanted to enter. The baby, nearly a year old, was in a little white outfit that Miss Ruth Ann had sewn, with that expression of someone who doesn't quite understand what's happening, but senses that it's important. When Catherine appeared in the chapel doorway and Theo saw her, with the roses in her hair and her eyes shining and her son on her hip, and that expression of someone who has reached the end of a very difficult road and recognizes that it was worth it. Something inside him that had been closed for 3 years, perhaps more than 3 years, perhaps always, opened completely. Pastor Elkins, who had baptized half the county and was a man of short sermons and deep practical wisdom, conducted a brief ceremony. He asked the usual questions with that quiet and steady voice that makes the usual questions sound new. "Theodore, do you take Catherine as your wife, to love and honor her, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, all the days of your life?" "I do," said Theo, looking at her without hesitation, without the weight of any second option. "Catherine, do you take Theodore as your husband, to love and honor him, in joy and in sorrow, in sickness and in health, all the days of your life?" Catherine stood for a moment looking at him. At that calloused and honest man who had opened the gate of the farm to a stranger and had, without planning to, opened along with it everything that was inside him. "I do," she said. And her voice didn't waver, because it wasn't nerves she was feeling. It was certainty. Miss Ruth Ann cried from beginning to end. Earl kept his gaze straight ahead, with his jaw set and his eyes bright. The colonel maintained his composed expression, but the cane struck the stone floor once, then twice, like applause. Michael, in his mother's arms throughout the ceremony, was quiet with that baby gravity that observes the world without judgment, until Pastor Elkins said, "You may kiss the bride." And Theo leaned toward Catherine and Michael. Between the two of them, grabbed the stepfather's chin with a chubby hand and looked at him with those dark eyes of his mother's and let out the trill that was his signature, his particular laugh, his way of saying what he didn't yet have words to say. The whole chapel laughed, and Theo, with the boy in his arms and the woman beside him, laughed too, with that full, real laugh that had slept for 3 years and had been waking slowly in the months before and was now, finally, completely awake. Good Hope Farm recovered, not all at once, not without effort, not without the days when the books wouldn't balance, and it was necessary to have faith that the next month would be better. Life is not a miracle that happens and then it's done. It is a series of choices made every single day, of waking up and deciding that it is worth continuing, of working with what you have toward what you want. The tobacco crop, tended with patience and knowledge, and with the specific love of someone who knows they are caring for something that belongs to the future as much as to the past, came back into full production by the second season. The drought broke, the rains returned on a regular schedule, and the red earth that had cracked and hardened responded as good earth responds when it receives water, with generosity, with life, with that abundance that is a reminder that nature never gives up entirely. The cattle herd was rebuilt gradually. The debts were paid one by one, with that particular dignity of someone who honors what they owe without needing anyone to come and collect. Michael grew up on the farm as if he were a native plant of it, rooted, belonging, part of the landscape as much as the oak trees and the tobacco fields that he would learn later to tend and harvest and love. He grew up calling Theo Dad from the moment he had the words for it, because Theo was his dad. It was not complicated, not ambiguous, needed no explanation. He was the man who picked him up when he fell, who taught him to ride a horse, who took him to church every Sunday, who stayed outside the bedroom door when there were nightmares and who came in when he was called. He was the dad. Catherine flourished. It is the only word that fits. She flourished. like the rose bush in the yard that had gone without flowers for years and had needed only someone who would prune it with care and feed it with attention. She who had arrived broken, rebuilt herself inside that house, and the version that emerged was the same person but more whole, more confident, more able to know that she deserved what she had and that what she had was real. Did she argue with Theo? She argued. They were two stubborn people who knew what they wanted and didn't back down easily. There were days of heavy silence. There were difficult conversations. There were moments when each of them had to swallow their own pride and meet the other halfway. But there was respect. There was love. There was the renewed decision every day to choose what they had built with such care. Colonel James Drummond came, with time, more frequently to the farm. First on the formal occasions, Christmas, birthdays. Then on the visits without specific reason, which is when visits become habit and habit becomes family. He arrived with the silver-handled cane and with some small gift for Michael, a carved wooden horse, a little leather hat, a story told on the porch in that deep voice that became slightly different when it was for his grandson, because that was what Michael was to the Colonel, his grandson. Without adjective, without qualification, without the distinction the old man could have made and didn't. Grandson. There was a specific afternoon that Theo kept in his memory. The Colonel was on the porch with Michael, the boy already 3 years old, full of energy and words. And the old man was telling a story about the farm in the old days, about how Theo's grandfather had come on foot to land that belonged to no one and had planted the first tobacco plant with his own hands. Michael listened with the total attention that children give to stories when they sense they are important. "And did the whole tobacco field come from the first plant?" asked Michael. "From the first plant and a great deal of work," said the Colonel. "Everything that matters starts small and grows with care." Michael processed that information with 3-year-old seriousness. "Like Mama's rose bush," he said. The Colonel looked at the boy. For a moment, there was an expression on that lined and severe face that Theo, watching from the office window, recognized. It was the same expression that had appeared when Michael had smiled at the Colonel the first time they met. It was tenderness. It was love. It was the old man learning, late but not too late, that there were things more important than wealth and position. "Just like your mama's rose bush," agreed the Colonel. "Exactly. There are things that cannot be explained by logic, and that logic, honestly, is not equipped to explain. That a pregnant woman alone with nowhere to go would arrive at precisely the gate of a man who was alone and needed without knowing it. That a baby would be born on a rainy night in the back room of a farmhouse, and that in growing would bring life back to a house that had decided to be dead. That a crisis, pestilence, drought, debt, would be what forces two closed hearts to open, because sometimes it is exactly the pressure that makes us understand what truly matters. That a sick baby with a high fever on a November night would be what removes the last hesitations of a man who had spent months avoiding saying what he felt. Coincidence, some would say. Others would say there is no coincidence, that there is an invisible geometry in human lives, an order we do not fully understand, but that operates with a wisdom beyond any rational explanation. That there is an intelligence in the universe that does not take the shape of human things, but tends to human things all the same. Theo, who had been raised going to church and who had stopped after Eleanor left, because there was a resentment in there, a question without answer that he didn't know how to ask without it feeling like blasphemy, began going again. Not with the memorized words of childhood, but with the prayer that is made when you are an adult and recognize that there are things you don't control and don't need to control, the prayer of the grateful. Thank you for the rain. Thank you for the land. Thank you for the harvest. Thank you for the man who taught me work, even in difficult ways. Thank you for the woman who taught me to be whole again. Thank you for the son who taught me that love doesn't need blood to be real. Thank you for the second chance, which is not different from the first, which is the same gift given again to someone who has learned how to receive it. Catherine prayed in the morning before the house woke up. In that half hour of silence, she had learned to keep for herself the way you keep a water reserve for the drought. She prayed with the surrender she had discovered in the little back room on her first night, the surrender of someone who has nothing left to offer but their own presence and discovers that it is enough. Michael prayed the way children do, with literal faith and without complication, asking specific things of a God he imagined as a kind grandfather in the sky, and giving thanks in the morning for the day that had begun, as if the day were a gift that arrived wrapped. There was, on Good Hope Farm, a quality of life that didn't appear in any numbers, that was in how people treated each other, in how the work was done with respect, in how meals were shared and stories told and difficulties faced together. It was the kind of wealth that appears on no balance sheet, but is the only kind that in the end makes any difference. Many years later, when Michael was already a tall young man with his mother's eyes and his father's hands, when the farm had become prosperous again and the tobacco fields had been expanded and modernized without losing their character, when Colonel James Drummond had aged and softened and discovered, late but genuinely, that it was possible to be a father and grandfather in ways that didn't include rigidity and demands. Many years later, on a December night, the family was gathered on the porch. It was Christmas Eve. The yard was lit with glass lanterns that Catherine had bought in town and hung in the branches of the old oak trees, and the effect was that of lights floating in the dark, which is one of the most beautiful spectacles you can make with simple things. The supper table had been set outside because the night was warm and good, and there was the smell of smoked brisket and sweet potato pie and freshly brewed coffee. The Colonel was in a corner with Michael, who was 12 years old and was hearing the story of the farm from his grandfather. The same story that had been told on the porch when the boy was 3, but now with more detail, more nuance, with the gravity of someone who knows they are passing on something that needs to be passed on. Earl and Dottie were at the table with their children and grandchildren who sometimes came to the farm on weekends and had learned to think of Good Hope as a second home. Miss Ruth Ann had been gone for 2 years, not from this life, but from the farm, because her children in Knoxville had finally convinced her she was too old to live alone, and she had agreed with a reluctance that was more tribute to the place than refusal to go. Before leaving, she had taken Catherine aside and said, "You arrived here in that state, honey. Pause. And look what you made of it." She had placed her hand on Catherine's face with the tenderness of old people who are no longer afraid to show what they feel. "The Lord knew what he was doing when he sent you here." Catherine had held the old woman and stayed like that for a long moment, breathing in the smell of soap and accumulated history. And now, on that Christmas Eve, Catherine was sitting beside Theo at the outdoor table, his hand covering hers on the linen tablecloth, talking about small and important things at the same time, about the harvest that had been good, about the roof repair needed on the silo, about Michael's teacher who had said the boy had a particular gift for science. "He's going to be an agronomist," said Theo, with that quiet certainty of his. "Or a doctor," said Catherine, with the smile of someone who has an opinion but won't press it. "Or a pastor," said Theo. Catherine looked at him. "A pastor? You saw how serious he got during Pastor Elkins's sermon last Sunday." "That was because he wanted to get out and play ball, Theo." "Or deep devotion." "Theo." "I'm joking," she laughed. And he laughed with her, the laugh of people sharing the same joke for years, and the joke is still funny, because it's not the joke that's funny, it's the person. Thunder nickered in the stable, far off, as if joining the conversation. The glass lanterns swayed gently in the warm December breeze. Michael and the Colonel laughed together in the corner, a laugh that shared the same note in both of them, the way things of family repeat themselves even when they aren't of blood, because love has its own genetics. And Theo, with his hand over Catherine's on the lit yard table of the farm that had survived the blight and the drought and the debt and the grief and its own tendency to close, looked at all of it, at the son, at the father, at Earl, at the full table, at the woman beside him, and thought the simple and true thing one thinks when life, after everything, exceeds what you had dared to hope for, that it was good, that every difficult piece was worth it. That good land produces when someone doesn't give up on it, that good people flourish when someone has the courage to care for them, that there is, in this world, a goodness more fundamental than anything we do or fail to do, a goodness that operates in silence, that plants meetings in the middle of dirt roads, that sends rain when the earth is driest, that puts the right person at the wrong gate at the right time, and that the only mistake one can make before this goodness is failing to recognize it when it arrives. He recognized it. The rose bush in the yard was in bloom, as it always was now. No longer the abandoned and forgotten rose bush that had rattled against the window the night Michael was born, but a tended rose bush, pruned with care, fed in the right seasons, which had responded to the attention with the particular generosity of things that need only care to give their best. Pink flowers in every season where flowers are possible, and even in the seasons where they are not, the shrub remained green and steady, with that quiet stubbornness that is perhaps the most honest lesson nature offers. That it is possible to stay, that it is possible to resist, that it is possible to bloom again, always.